Enemy advances. We must hold the line up. Understood, sir. The reserves are ready. Good. No retreat.
December 19th, 1944, 10 Downing Street, London. Winston Churchill stares at a telegram from Chef. Patton has promised Eisenhower he can disengage Third Army from combat, pivot 90 degrees, and attack toward Bastogne in 72 hours. Churchill sets down his cigar. This isn't strategy. This is madness. The British military establishment has spent 5 years learning one lesson. You don't improvise with armies. You plan. You prepare. You coordinate. Patton is proposing to do the opposite, to throw an entire army sideways into winter conditions without the methodical preparation that one campaigns.
The situation demands immediate action. The plans are ready, sir. Then proceed without delay. The northern flank is vulnerable. I agree, we must reinforce it. Deploy the reserves from here. Understood.
In the war room, British staff officers calculate the risks. Exposed flanks, broken supply lines, units arriving piecemeal. This could become the disaster that hands Germany a propaganda victory. Churchill knows what must be said publicly, but privately, he asks the question that haunts every Allied leader. Has Patton finally gone too far? When news of Patton's promise reached London on December 19th, the reaction in British military circles was disbelief bordering on alarm. Field Marshal Alan Brooke, Chief of the Imperial General Staff and Churchill's closest military advisor.
The line must hold here. Understood. Reinforcements are on their way. General, the situation is dire. We must act now. I agree, Prime Minister. Our forces are ready. Good. Proceed.
Received the report during his daily briefing. According to those present, Brooke's response was characteristically skeptical. American commanders were prone to optimistic timelines that bore no relation to military reality. The British military establishment in 1944 operated on principles forged through 5 years of war and centuries of professional military tradition. Operations required careful planning. Logistics had to be arranged systematically. Units needed time to disengage from combat, reorganize, and prepare for new missions. The idea that an entire army, 6 divisions, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, could simply turn 90 degrees and attack in a different direction within days, violated everything British staff officers had been taught. Churchill himself had reason to be wary of American operational methods. Throughout the campaign in Northwest Europe, he had watched with concern as American commanders took risks that British doctrine considered reckless. The race across France in August had been spectacular, but had ended with Third Army immobilized by fuel shortages. Market Garden in September, though Montgomery's plan, had been executed with American airborne divisions and had failed catastrophically. Now Patton was proposing another operation that seemed to prioritize speed over prudence. The strategic situation made Churchill's concern acute. The German offensive in the Ardennes had created genuine crisis. If it succeeded in reaching Antwerp and splitting Allied forces, the entire campaign in Northwest Europe could unravel. British forces under Montgomery's command were being repositioned to shore up the northern shoulder of the German penetration. American forces were scattered and disorganized. This was precisely the moment when careful, methodical response was essential, not reckless improvisation. British intelligence assessments of Patton's capability added another layer of worry. Yes, Third Army had demonstrated impressive operational mobility during the advance across France, but that had been exploitation against a retreating enemy. What Patton was now proposing was fundamentally different, disengaging from active combat, conducting a complex administrative movement in winter conditions, and immediately attacking prepared German positions. The British Army had attempted similar operations, most recently in Italy, and knew from painful experience how easily such maneuvers could collapse into chaos. Churchill's political position made the situation even more delicate. By December 1944, the United States was providing the majority of Allied ground forces in Northwest Europe. American commanders were increasingly asserting independence from British strategic oversight. Eisenhower, as Supreme Commander, maintained the appearance of Allied unity, but everyone understood that American military power was dominant. If Churchill openly questioned Patton's plan, it would be interpreted as British doubting American capability, a diplomatic nightmare regardless of whether the military concerns were valid. The timing could not have been worse. Churchill was already managing tensions with Stalin over Poland's post-war status, navigating complex negotiations about Allied strategy in the Mediterranean, and dealing with growing American skepticism about British imperial interests. The last thing he needed was a military disaster in the Ardennes that could be blamed on allowing an American general to execute a reckless operation without proper oversight. In private discussions with Brooke and other senior advisors, Churchill expressed the concern that would define British elites' view of Patton's maneuver. This was either going to be a spectacular vindication of aggressive American methods or a catastrophic failure that would expose the limits of improvisation in modern warfare, and Britain would be implicated either way, praised if it succeeded, blamed if it failed for not restraining American recklessness. In the corridors of the War Office and among British liaison officers at Chef, a question circulated that nobody wanted to ask officially. What happens if Patton fails? The implications were strategic, political, and psychological, and all of them were dire. Strategically, if Third Army's attack toward Bastogne collapsed, German forces would have proven they could defeat coordinated Allied counteroffensives. The 101st Airborne, surrounded and running low on ammunition, would likely be forced to surrender. The first major American formation to capitulate since Patton in 1942. German propaganda would trumpet the victory. More importantly, the psychological impact on Allied soldiers and home front morale would be devastating. Christmas 1944 would be remembered not as the beginning of final victory, but as the moment when German determination nearly reversed Allied gains. Politically, a failed relief operation would vindicate critics who had argued that American commanders lacked the operational sophistication necessary for high command. British military circles had long maintained quiet skepticism about American tactical capabilities. Market Garden's failure had been blamed on Montgomery, but British observers noted that American airborne divisions had failed to achieve their objectives. If Patton's relief attempt failed, it would confirm what some British officers already believed. Americans could win through material superiority, but couldn't execute complex operations requiring finesse. The concern wasn't publicly voiced because Anglo-American alliance required maintaining the fiction of complete confidence in each other's military competence. But in private conversations recorded by aides and staff officers, British military leaders expressed profound anxiety about the risk Patton was taking. They calculated the operational challenges. Third Army would have to disengage from combat around Metz, move north through winter conditions on roads that might be impassable, arrive at attack positions in coordination rather than piecemeal, and immediately assault German forces who would have had days to prepare defenses. British military planning operated on different timelines precisely because of these challenges. When Montgomery proposed operations, his staff calculated movement times that included buffers for delays, mechanical breakdowns, weather complications, and enemy interference. Patton's timeline included none of these safety margins. He was promising to do in 72 hours what British planning methodology suggested would require at least a week, probably 2. Field Marshal Brooke's diary entries from this period, not published until decades later, reveal the depth of British concern. He questioned whether American staff work was adequate to coordinate such complex movements. He noted that Third Army's supply situation was precarious even before adding the logistics challenges of a 90-degree pivot. Most tellingly, he expressed worry that Patton's personal ambition, his desire to be the general who saved Bastogne, was driving operational decisions that should have been based on careful assessment of feasibility. Churchill faced a particular dilemma as both political leader and military strategist. His instinct, forged through decades of military study and 5 years of directing Britain's war effort, told him that Patton's plan was dangerously optimistic. But he also understood that publicly expressing doubt would create exactly the kind of Allied disunity that Germany hoped to achieve through the Ardennes offensive. If British leaders questioned American operational decisions, it would validate Hitler's assumption that the Allied coalition was fragile and might fracture under pressure. The solution Churchill adopted was characteristically complex. Publicly, he would express complete confidence in Allied response to the German offensive. He would praise American fighting qualities and emphasize Allied unity. But privately, he would ensure that British forces under Montgomery were positioned to stabilize the situation if Third Army's relief attempt failed. He would maintain diplomatic channels to Eisenhower that allowed for quiet British influence on American operational decisions without appearing to usurp command authority. This dual approach reflected Churchill's understanding that managing alliance politics was as important as managing military operations, but it also revealed his genuine fear that Patton's operation might fail and that failure would have consequences extending far beyond the immediate tactical situation in the Ardennes. On December 22nd, as Third Army's lead elements began attacking toward Bastogne, British liaison officers embedded with American forces sent reports to London that created confusion in the War Office. The movement was actually occurring. Units were disengaging from combat around Metz, moving north, and beginning coordinated attacks, all within the timeline Patton had promised. It shouldn't have been possible, but it was happening. The British military establishment's response to this development was complex and uncomfortable. On one level, there was professional admiration for the staff work and unit discipline that allowed such rapid reorientation. British officers understood what was required to move an army that distance that quickly. The planning, the coordination, the leadership at every level from corps to platoon. The Third Army was executing its successfully demonstrated capabilities that commanded respect. But admiration was mixed with something less generous. Irritation that Americans were succeeding with methods British doctrine considered unsound. The very success of Patton's operation challenged fundamental assumptions about how modern armies should be commanded. If Patton could improvise on this scale and succeed, what did that say about the British emphasis on methodical planning? Were British methods overly cautious, sacrificing operational opportunities for the sake of coordination that ultimately slowed tempo more than it ensured success? Field Marshal Montgomery, commanding Allied ground forces on the northern shoulder of the German penetration, watched Third Army's progress with particular ambivalence. Montgomery had built his reputation on careful set-piece operations that minimized risk through overwhelming preparation. Market Garden's failure had already raised questions about whether his methods could adapt to fluid situations. Now Patton was demonstrating that aggressive improvisation could achieve results Montgomery's careful planning had not. The cultural dimension of this tension was significant. British military culture valued staff work, coordination, and systematic approach to operations. Officers were trained to analyze situations thoroughly, develop comprehensive plans, and execute with precision. American military culture, at least as embodied by Patton, valued speed, initiative, and willingness to accept risk in exchange for operational advantage. Neither approach was inherently superior, but they reflected fundamentally different philosophies about warfare. Churchill understood these cultural differences better than most British leaders because he had spent years working with American commanders. He recognized that American operational methods were not simply reckless improvisation. They reflected deliberate choices about how to employ superior material resources and a military culture that rewarded aggressive action. But he also understood that British military leaders found Patton's methods professionally unsettling because they suggested that careful planning might matter less than speed and audacity. The reports coming from Third Army's advance created a dilemma for British strategic assessment. If the relief operation succeeded, it would validate Patton's methods and potentially call into question British operational caution. If it failed, and on December 22, 23, success was far from certain, it would confirm British skepticism, but create a military disaster that would harm the entire Allied effort. Either outcome was uncomfortable from a British strategic perspective. By December 24th, Third Army's progress had advanced sufficiently that British planners began revising their assessments of the overall Ardennes situation. The German offensive was being contained. American defenses at St. Vith and Bastogne had disrupted German timetables, and Third Army's counterattack was creating pressure on German southern flank that would soon force Wehrmacht commanders to choose between pressing their offensive and preventing encirclement of their own forces. Churchill received these updates with relief, tempered by recognition that the crisis wasn't over. Bastogne remained surrounded. Winter weather complicated all operations. German forces were still capable of inflicting significant damage on exposed American units. The relief operation's success was not yet assured, and even if it succeeded, the cost would be measured in thousands of American casualties. But the trend was becoming clear. Patton's gamble was working, and British concerns about the operation's feasibility were being proven wrong. This created an awkward situation for British military and political leaders who had privately doubted the operation could succeed. They couldn't publicly acknowledge those doubts without appearing to have lacked faith in Allied capability. But they also couldn't simply celebrate the success without recognizing that it challenged British assumptions about proper military operations. The solution was to praise American fighting qualities while maintaining studied silence about the operational methods that had enabled those qualities to be employed effectively. On January 18, 1945, Winston Churchill rose in the House of Commons to address the Battle of the Bulge. By then, the crisis had passed. Bastogne had been relieved on December 26th. American forces had eliminated the German salient. The Wehrmacht's last major offensive in the West had failed. Churchill's task was to put the battle in proper perspective for British and Allied audiences while managing complex political considerations about Anglo-American relations. What Churchill said publicly became the official British assessment. This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory. The words were generous, appropriate, and politically essential. They reinforced Allied unity, praised American military capability, and positioned the battle as vindication of Allied strategy. But what Churchill said publicly was carefully crafted to serve diplomatic purposes, rather than express his private assessment. According to aides and staff officers who later recorded their observations, Churchill's private view of the Battle of the Bulge was more nuanced and considerably less celebratory than his public speech suggested. He recognized American courage and tenacity, but he also believed the battle had revealed serious flaws in Allied strategy and command. Churchill's private concerns centered on how the German offensive had achieved such complete surprise. British intelligence had detected indications of German buildup in the Ardennes, but had not assessed the information as suggesting major offensive. American intelligence had similarly failed to recognize the threat. The initial German success suggested that Allied command structures had become complacent, assuming German offensive capability was exhausted when it clearly was not. More troubling from Churchill's perspective was the question of whether the crisis could have been avoided through more cautious Allied strategy. British military philosophy emphasized maintaining balanced fronts and sufficient reserves to respond to unexpected developments. American commanders, particularly Patton, had favored aggressive advances that stretched supply lines and left thin defensive coverage in quiet sectors like the Ardennes. The German offensive had exploited exactly the kind of weakness that British caution was designed to prevent. Patton's relief operation, while successful, had not resolved Churchill's fundamental concerns about American operational methods. Yes, Third Army had executed a spectacular maneuver that achieved tactical objectives. But from a British strategic perspective, the entire situation, from the German breakthrough to the desperate relief operation, represented the kind of crisis that proper planning should have prevented. That American audacity had saved the situation didn't change the fact that American approach to operations had helped create the situation in the first place. The political dimensions of Churchill's speech were as important as the military assessment. By January 1945, Britain's relative power within the Allied coalition was declining. American military and economic dominance was increasingly apparent. Churchill needed to maintain British influence on Allied strategy while acknowledging American primacy. Praising the American response to the Bulge was politically essential, even if Churchill harbored private reservations about American operational methods. Churchill also had to consider Soviet perceptions. Stalin was watching carefully for any signs of Anglo-American friction that might be exploited in post-war negotiations. A British leader appearing to criticize American military performance would have been noted in Moscow and potentially used against Western interests. Churchill's generous public assessment of American performance served diplomatic purposes that transcended honest military analysis. The speech Churchill gave was masterful precisely because it accomplished multiple objectives simultaneously. It maintained Allied unity, praised American courage, positioned the battle as strategic victory, and avoided raising uncomfortable questions about how the crisis occurred in the first place. But it was also carefully constructed to avoid endorsing specifically American operational methods that Churchill and British military leaders still found troubling. What Churchill said publicly became historical record. What he thought privately, his concerns about operational improvisation, his doubts about Patton's methods, his belief that British caution might have prevented the crisis, was confined to private discussions and diary entries that wouldn't be fully revealed for decades. The gap between public statement and private assessment revealed the complexity of maintaining alliance cohesion while harboring genuine strategic disagreements. In the months following the Battle of the Bulge, as Allied forces prepared for final operations across the Rhine into Germany, the question of Patton's 90-degree pivot continued to generate quiet discussion in British military circles. The operation's success was undeniable, but its implications for Allied command and operational doctrine remained unsettling for British military leadership. Field Marshal Brooks' diary entries from early 1945 reveal ongoing tension about American operational style. He acknowledged Third Army's achievement while expressing concern that American commanders might draw wrong lessons from the success. The danger, from Brooks' perspective, was that Patton's spectacular maneuver would encourage similar improvisation in future operations where circumstances might not favor such bold action. Success in the Ardennes didn't validate improvisation as general principle. It demonstrated that in specific circumstances, with particular forces, aggressive action could achieve objectives despite obvious risks. The cultural clash between British and American military philosophies became more apparent in operations after the Bulge. Montgomery's crossing of the Rhine in March 1945, Operation Plunder, epitomized British operational method. The operation employed massive artillery preparation, extensive air support, and airborne drops to ensure success. It was methodical, comprehensive, and achieved its objectives with acceptable casualties. Patton's Rhine crossing at Oppenheim, conducted the night before Montgomery's operation without artillery preparation or airborne support, represented the opposite philosophy. Move fast, accept risk, exploit surprise. Churchill watched these parallel operations with the understanding that they represented not just different tactical choices, but fundamentally different approaches to warfare. British methods prioritized certainty and control. American methods, at least as practiced by Patton, prioritized speed and opportunity. Both could be effective, but they reflected different strategic cultures and different tolerance for operational risk. The long-term implications of the Ardennes campaign for Anglo-American military relations were subtle but significant. American confidence in their operational methods was reinforced by Third Army's success. British concerns about American tactical recklessness were somewhat vindicated by the fact that the crisis had occurred partly due to American operational choices. But neither side publicly acknowledged these tensions because alliance cohesion required maintaining the fiction that operational philosophies were complementary rather than contradictory. Churchill's own assessment, recorded in his multi-volume history of World War II, captured his ambivalence about American operational style. He praised American fighting spirit and material superiority, while subtly noting British contributions to strategic planning and operational coordination. His account of the Battle of the Bulge emphasized Allied unity while carefully avoiding detailed analysis of how different operational philosophies had shaped Allied response to the German offensive. What Churchill said when Patton pulled off his impossible 90-degree pivot was ultimately less significant than what he couldn't say, that the operation's success had created uncomfortable questions about whether British operational caution was appropriate for modern warfare, or whether it represented institutional inertia that sacrificed operational opportunities for the sake of coordination and control. These questions would influence British military doctrine for decades, contributing to post-war reforms that tried to balance planning discipline with operational flexibility. The broader historical significance of the episode was that it revealed tensions within the Allied coalition that had been carefully managed during the war, but would emerge more openly afterward. British and American military cultures differed fundamentally in their approach to risk, planning, and operational command. During the war, these differences were subordinated to the imperative of defeating Germany, but they represented genuine philosophical divides about how modern armies should be commanded. Patton's 90-degree pivot became legendary in American military culture as example of aggressive leadership and operational audacity. In British military culture, it was noted as impressive achievement, while privately serving as cautionary example of risks inherent in improvised operations. Neither perspective was wrong. Both captured important truths about warfare that commanders must balance: the need for planning versus the value of speed, the importance of coordination versus the advantage of surprise, the requirement for control versus the necessity of initiative. What Churchill said publicly, that the Battle of the Bulge was the greatest American battle of the war, became historical consensus. What British military leaders thought privately, that Patton's methods were brilliant but dangerous, shaped British operational doctrine in ways that influenced the British Army's approach to operations for the remainder of the 20th century. The discomfort that Patton's impossible 90-degree pivot created for British strategic culture was never fully resolved, because it touched on fundamental questions about military leadership that admit no simple answers.